Thank you, Mr. President. And might I just say thank you very much to the members here who made contributions and made this a very interesting and worthwhile debate in this place on the motion. I really appreciate the thought and the time and the preparation that went into the contributions that were made, and for people's engagement with the briefings that we received and with the material that they have been sent by advocates and by others in the community. I really appreciate it. I think it's very positive that we have these contributions on the public record and on the parliamentary record, and I think it's been very reflective of the overwhelming evidence base, the national and international sentiment towards this occurring, and the inevitability, really, that this is the path we are on. We will be doing this at some point. And it's for our state to decide, and for the leaders of our state to decide when that happens. I certainly brought this on for debate to help progress the public conversation and the political conversation around it, hoping that there'd be some receptivity there to look at the opportunity we have to be leaders and to be responding to solid evidence bases and solid national and international advocacy, and very compelling local advocacy. So thank you to those who've responded to that and engaged with it. I found all the contributions particularly of interest and thoughtful and useful. Thank you to the member for Murchison for a very thorough and extended look at the different matters around this issue. I particularly appreciated the time you spent recognising the limitations we have of accessing support services in this state, and particularly in parts of the state that are more regional and remote, and that there is, of course, the need for us to do much better in providing those sorts of services. We do need to change the way we do things, and regardless of when this eventuality comes to pass, we will need to be looking at how we better meet the needs through service provision of the people of our state. Member for Mersey, thank you for your contribution. I found it very thoughtful and pointed to a lot of the evidence base that was there. You're right, we do need to develop systems that are based on science and evidence. And you picked up on that reality that we don't actually need to delay doing this as a state. We could actually be looking at it for ourselves. Thank you to the member for Rumney. I appreciated your contribution, and I particularly found it interesting and quite compelling to hear you reflect on your daughter as a 10-year-old. And that does, I think most people, when they hear that the current age of responsibility is 10, tend to think of those people in their lives who are around that age and contemplate what that might mean for children of that age group. You talked about the fact that it's not about holding young people responsible. It's not about disregarding holding young people responsible. You talked about it being about holding them responsible appropriately and in a trauma-informed way, and I thought that was spot on, that we're not just going to whip away that age and leave a void and a vacuum. Absolutely no one is suggesting that, despite how the government may like to paint this motion and mischaracterise the call that it's making. That, of course, is not something that any of us are calling for. It's a shame that we can't honestly engage with the content of the motion from the government's point of view. I'm disappointed about that. I very much appreciated the member for Elwick's contribution. He had insight into this as previously being a teacher. He talked about the fact that we do identify young people very readily through the education system who are going to ultimately potentially end up in situations where they encounter the youth justice system. And he talked about the waste of human potential when we don't respond and we leave it too late. We've missed opportunities for early intervention when flags were raised, and we end up in later stages of behaviour and later stages of urgency trying to respond in a way that can be healing and helpful. it was interesting for many members' contributions to have reflections on Ashley Youth Detention Centre, and I very much appreciated that came from a range of members who had different reasons to encounter Ashley Detention Centre and were able to bring those personal reflections. I thank them for that. I haven't been to Ashley Youth Detention Centre personally, so I always find it interesting to hear from people who have, with different hats on. The member for Hobart, thank you for your reflections. I thought your reflections about someone who installed a computer system at Ashley Youth Detention Centre was a one out of left field that I hadn't been expecting, but that was interesting. And going through the custodial inspector's report was an interesting way to be considering some matters that related to this topic.
If I may, what I didn't do was actually go to the same report for Risdon Prison and look at what they've actually found there, and you think to yourself, you want to put children into that circumstance at the end of what they go through. Well,
we certainly know that there's a clear trajectory from one to the other, don't we?
You just wouldn't want to put them there.
Yeah. That's the trajectory that we're trying to disrupt here with making evidence-based changes to the way we do things, which have been shown not to work well. I did note that you raised the idea that there have to be exceptions, I think was the way you talked about it. I think that's part of that conversation about the complexity of implementation that is necessary, that we all recognise is necessary and a part of this process. For me, my first response to that concept of exceptions is to think, well, what would be our exceptional response? Rather than where would we make an exception and say that child is so bad we're going to punish them in this way. My response would be, I wonder what we would establish as exceptional responses to respond to those sorts of severity or urgency. But that would be a very good conversation to have as part of the implementation planning with those who are expert in these areas. Yeah, I agree. And of course other jurisdictions, many of them around the world, have grappled with similar things. We would draw on the overwhelming evidence base that would be there for us to look at and to see, especially for those jurisdictions who have made this sort of change some time past, and we can see how it's played out over time and what that tells us. The member for Launceston, thank you for your personal reflections too. I thought that added a lot of flavour to this debate, as had others. I was slightly concerned about the idea of police giving macas to young children as inducements to confess. And unfortunately, that bit stuck in my mind probably a little bit too much, but I just would hope that wouldn't be happening too often out there in the community.
Mr. President, it was more my complaint to them that they were looking after these kids too well, and they said they found that they got better responses if they weren't hungry. Well, they gave them things they liked, which they probably didn't get very often.
I mean, that in itself is very illustrative. They found it was easier to work with the children when they met their needs and their basic need of hunger.
So I don't think it was a bribery. It was more that they were giving them things that they liked.
I'm taking that on face value now.
It became more conciliatory.
I'm taking that on face value now, and I'm saying, isn't it interesting when you meet someone's basic needs, it becomes easier to work with them. They respond better. It becomes a better interaction. This is true of this whole system. It's actually what's behind the whole idea of raising the age of criminal responsibility, is that if we hadn't been failing to meet the needs, the clear and demonstrated needs of these children over an extended period of time and their families, they wouldn't have been in the situation they are now. So let's in a broader, less fast food way, give them their macas at an earlier point in the chain, perhaps.
Because if that option wasn't there at the age of 10, you'd be looking for other ways of trying to make the change
exactly right.
To impact on their behaviour. But because that's there at the age of 10, that's where we go with those really difficult kids. One of
the things that I've been reflecting on as listening to contributions is the idea about people feel an innate sense that we can't not hold these children responsible in some way for their behaviour, because it does have consequences and there may have been victims, and this sense of who is responsible, who can we hold responsible. And my reflection on that is that, well, while it might be tempting and an inclination to hold these children responsible, we should surely first have to hold ourselves responsible. Hold ourselves responsible as a community, hold ourselves responsible as a government, as a parliament, as service systems that have the ability to meet the needs of our community and the people in it, that have the ability to respond well and better and earlier when people have been shown to need support. That's our responsibility. Who's holding us responsible for that and holding us to account for that? And that's what I think this is inviting us to do more effectively. Again, thank you to the member for Pembroke for her contribution. I knew that with the background with the Youth Network of Tasmania, you would have some very pertinent reflections on this, and it was also very positive to hear about your experiences when you were in that role and again, encountering Ashley through different sorts of lenses to some of the others. You talked about the punitive approach being more likely to lead to reoffending, and that's just so squarely demonstrated in the evidence that we just can't go past the need to change that. Thank you to the member for McIntyre. I read your op-ed in the Examiner last Friday and thought it was excellent, and appreciated that as a contribution to the public conversation. And it was good to hear more around that from you today. Thank you. You did mention in relation, or in answer to the questions that you had put in the chamber, that the government had talked about their wanting to have a nation-leading approach and wanting to put things like wraparound support in place. And I, like you, was really heartened to hear that from the government, and it is very positive to hear that intent coming through. I think it does present us with the opportunity to consider at this early stage of that work where raising the age fits, because if we're doing this big redesign with excellent principles underpinning it, like wraparound support, like trauma-informed approaches, like restorative justice approaches, it's an ideal time to think about where we build in a raising of the age. And that brings me to the government's contribution, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm just going to talk briefly about the fact that I'm disappointed that the government felt the need to mischaracterise and misconstrue the motion. I think it presented them with a really interesting opportunity, very positive opportunity. In fact, the member for Elwick also emphasised the opportunity and hoped that the support from the opposition on this matter would be an encouragement to the government to see that it was something that they could be open and courageous about. Of course, to be utterly clear, absolutely no one, not me, not other members in this chamber, not any of those multitude of advocates out there in the community, including the Commissioner for Children, have ever suggested that we would raise the age of criminal responsibility in some sort of void or vacuum, that we would summarily do it straight off the bat without any process in place around it. What I will put on the record is what we heard very clearly in our briefing, and I believe it was Trevor McKenna from the Law Society of Tasmania who spoke to us in the briefing about the absolute imperative to actually see this change happen. You need the policy commitment first, and then you need the implementation plan. And unless you get that policy commitment put in place, unless you have the intention stated by the government, yes, this is something we want to do. We want to raise the age of criminal responsibility because we know overwhelmingly it is the evidence-informed and the right thing to do. And from that commitment, we then build a process to make it happen. And we do that through the things that the government mentioned, things like consulting with the community, things like having the TLRI provide expert advice, having other stakeholders provide expert advice. We lay out an absolutely credible and robust process of how we get there. But we don't do that And we don't do it in a comprehensive and effective way if we haven't made the commitment first. And that's what Trevor McKenna from the Law Society put to us in the briefing. We need the policy commitment, and then we need together to put the implementation plan in place. All the plans the government talked about in their contribution today could be part of that implementation planning and phase. All of it could. All they need to do is start that process, and it would fit very well into the other sorts of commitments they've made around closing Ashley, around reforming the approach, to say, as part of this, it is our intention to ultimately raise the age of criminal responsibility in this state to 14. And built in then, as we go forward over the next 1, 2, 3 years, across that process, we then put a robust plan in place, just like ACT are doing now.
Phase one out, phase one.
What a shame.
Yeah, and I think
what a shame.
Through you, what I heard was we'll let the Attorney Generals come back with a plan that they may not happen within 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years. We could still be in this position 10 years from now because the national body haven't made any changes or haven't made any suggestions.
Precisely right.
Mr President, by way of personal explanation, the Attorney-General did say in her contribution that she is progressing those talks as we speak.
Through the national group, and it could be forever. There's no commitment there at all.
So I'll pick up on that and just mention that, as I pointed out in my contribution, it's not on an agenda to be dealt with by that group, is my understanding, in the next 12 months in a definitive way. And here's the thing. Even if there's national agreement reached and a national intention formed through that group, as it may well be, we still have to do the work at a state level in this jurisdiction. Every jurisdiction looks a bit different. Every jurisdiction's service system looks a bit different. Each jurisdiction will have to make their own policy commitment, and they will have to make their own implementation plan. We are inevitably on the path to that. There is no way that we in this state are not raising the age of criminal responsibility to at least 14 at some point. It's happening. At some point we have to decide to do it, and we will put the implementation plan in place. What a shame that the government isn't taking the opportunity, it sounds, to do it at this moment when they have other very laudable and very positive plans in place in this space. So I must say, Mr President, I was disappointed in that. I was disappointed that the government couldn't be honest enough to engage with the motion without trying to misconstrue it, without trying to verbal it and say that it was something it isn't. None of us believe this is something that happens on a whim, in a moment's notice, or in a void or vacuum. All of us want to see this happen in a positive, comprehensive, constructive way in this state. And so I thank the members who have expressed support for the motion, and I commend the motion to the House.